The flashing lights of a police cruiser illuminated Marcus Carter, a black teenager accused of suspicious activity while walking home. As neighbors watched, his humiliation deepened until a sleek black car pulled up. A powerful woman stepped out, her words exposing the deep prejudice poisoning this community. What happened next would shock everyone, but let's start at the beginning. 15-year-old Marcus Carter was a typical teenager with a natural charm that shone through his warm smile. His deep brown skin glistened slightly under the setting sun, evidence of an intense basketball practice he had just finished. His lean frame moved effortlessly as he dribbled his basketball absent-mindedly, the steady rhythm providing a comforting soundtrack to his journey home. His headphones covered his ears, but not so tightly that he couldn't hear the faint rustling of leaves or the occasional chirp of birds in the nearby trees. He was in his element, his mind lost in the beats of his favorite playlist as he cut through the local park. The park itself was a picturesque slice of suburbia. Neatly trimmed hedges lined the stone pathway, and the soft hum of sprinklers echoed faintly in the background. The golden hour light bathed everything in a warm glow, making the already pristine lawns seem almost magical. It was a shortcut Marcus had taken countless times before, one he liked because it shaved precious minutes off his walk home and gave him time to think about his next game. As he approached a particularly quiet stretch, the spell of tranquility was abruptly shattered by a sharp, accusatory voice from behind. "Hey, what are you doing here?" Startled, Marcus stopped in his tracks and turned to face the source of the demand. Standing a few yards away was Mrs. Wilson, a stern-looking older white woman. Her graying hair was tied tightly into a bun, and her sharp blue eyes glared at Marcus with suspicion. She clutched her cardigan tightly around her, as though warding off an invisible threat. Marcus recognized her instantly. Everyone in the neighborhood did. Mrs. Wilson was infamous for her watchful eyes and tendency to see trouble where there was none. Caught off guard but maintaining his composure, Marcus removed one headphone and replied politely, "I'm just walking home from basketball practice, ma'am." His voice was calm, steady, and respectful. He didn't want to escalate the situation. His parents had taught him well. Always be polite, always be careful. Mrs. Wilson's eyes narrowed, her lips pursing into a thin, disapproving line. "This is private property, and I don't believe you belong here," she snapped, pointing an accusing finger at him. Marcus's heart sank, but he tried to reason with her. "I live just a few blocks away, ma'am," he explained. "I'm not doing anything wrong, just passing through on my way home." Her expression didn't soften. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police," she declared, her voice sharp and resolute. "Yes, officer," she began into the receiver, glancing at Marcus as though she were catching him red-handed. "There's a suspicious young man in the park. I think he's up to no good." Marcus stood there, the basketball now motionless under his arm. His heart thudded against his ribcage, not from fear, but from frustration. He knew where this was headed. He'd seen it play out too many times before, on the news and in his community. Despite his best efforts to appear non-threatening, he had become the target of Mrs. Wilson's assumptions. He sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping slightly. He wanted to argue, to plead his case, but he also knew that anything he said could be twisted against him. All he could do was wait and hope that this, like so many other moments of injustice, would pass without becoming something worse. The peaceful ambience of the park was shattered as the shrill wail of a siren pierced the air, its red and blue lights bouncing off the leafy trees and manicured hedges. Within minutes, a police cruiser came to a stop at the edge of the park, its presence an unmistakable sign that things were escalating quickly. The two officers who stepped out were an imposing sight. Tall, uniformed men with stern expressions etched into their faces, their hands instinctively resting near their holsters as they surveyed the scene. One of the officers, the taller of the two, fixed his gaze on Marcus and barked sharply, "Put the basketball down and keep your hands where we can see them." The command hit Marcus like a physical blow, but he complied immediately, gently placing his basketball on the ground and raising his hands. His movements were slow and deliberate, his body tense with the effort to appear non-threatening. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice steady but laced with a subtle tremor. It wasn't just fear, it was the sting of humiliation and the weight of knowing this could escalate further despite his innocence. Mrs. Wilson, now standing just a few feet away, folded her arms across her chest with a smug expression. Her sharp features betrayed a sense of satisfaction as she addressed the officers. "I told you, officer. He's been wandering around here, probably looking for something to steal," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. Her words hung in the air like a dagger, aimed squarely at Marcus. The officers turned their attention back to Marcus. "ID!" one of them demanded curtly. Marcus swallowed hard, shaking his head slightly. "I didn't bring it with me," he explained, trying to keep his voice calm and respectful. "I was just at basketball practice. I don't carry my ID when I'm playing." The taller officer's jaw tightened. Without a word, he stepped forward and began patting Marcus down, his hands moving brusquely over the boy's pockets and waistband. The action felt invasive and unnecessary, each motion a reminder of the distrust aimed at Marcus simply for being there. Marcus clenched his jaw, willing himself to endure the indignity without protest. He knew that resisting would only make things worse. By now, the commotion had drawn the attention of the neighborhood. Curtains fluttered in the windows of nearby homes as curious faces peeked out. A few people stepped onto their porches, their postures hesitant yet intrigued. The murmurs began, soft whispers that carried judgment, sympathy, or indifference, depending on the onlooker. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, their scrutiny adding to the heat of his embarrassment. "I just want to go home," Marcus said softly, almost to himself, his voice barely audible above the faint chatter of the crowd. His chest felt tight, as if the weight of the situation was pressing the air from his lungs. He stared at the ground, avoiding the eyes of the officers and the neighbors alike. The basketball lay forgotten at his feet, a stark symbol of the simple, ordinary day that had spiraled into something far more humiliating and threatening. The quiet tension in the air was disrupted by the smooth hum of an engine. A sleek black car glided to a stop at the curb, its polished exterior gleaming under the park's streetlights. The car door opened with precision, and a striking black woman stepped out, her presence demanding attention before she even spoke. Dressed in a sharp navy suit that fit her perfectly, she exuded authority and elegance. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she walked toward the scene with a purposeful stride, her piercing gaze scanning the unfolding situation. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady yet laced with an undeniable edge of authority. Every word was deliberate, calm but carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs of the growing crowd. "What's going on here?" One of the officers, momentarily caught off guard by her sudden arrival, turned to face her. His previously stern demeanor faltered slightly, replaced by hesitation. "This young man is under investigation for suspicious activity," he said, his tone less confident than before. The woman's dark eyes narrowed as they flicked from Marcus, standing still with his hands visible, to Mrs. Wilson, whose smug expression began to falter under the weight of this newcomer's scrutiny. "Suspicious activity?" she repeated, her voice sharpening. "Walking home from basketball practice is suspicious now?" Mrs. Wilson, her confidence visibly shaken, stepped forward, her frown deepening. "Who are you?" she demanded, though her voice lacked the commanding presence she'd wielded moments ago. The woman turned toward her, her face cool and composed, as if she had been preparing for this moment all along. Her response was measured, but each word carried a distinct gravity. "I'm Angela Carter," she said, holding Mrs. Wilson's gaze without flinching. "Marcus is my son. Oh, and I'm also the mayor of this city." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Heads turned, whispers erupted, and a few people instinctively stepped back, as if realizing the magnitude of what had just unfolded. The officers exchanged quick, uneasy glances, their postures stiffening. Mrs. Wilson's face drained of color, her previous air of authority replaced with visible discomfort. Her lips moved as if to form words, but no sound came out. She looked from Marcus to Angela, then back to the officers, searching for an anchor in a situation that was now clearly slipping from her control. Angela Carter stood tall and unwavering, her gaze sweeping over the scene with quiet power. To Marcus, still rooted in place, her presence felt like a lifeline, a beacon of safety in the storm that had threatened to consume him. The officers stiffened, realizing their mistake. "We didn't know, ma'am." Angela held up a hand to silence them. "You didn't know? Did you ask? Or did you assume he was up to no good because of the color of his skin?" Mrs. Wilson paled, her confidence draining. I just thought—" "You thought wrong," Angela snapped. "You called the police on a child for walking through a public park. Do you realize the danger you put him in? Do you understand how easily this could have ended tragically?" Mrs. Wilson stammered, but Angela didn't wait for an answer. She turned to the officers. "You're supposed to protect this community, not profile its children. I'll be following up with your department about this incident." Angela then placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Come on, son. Let's go home." As they walked away, the crowd dispersed, some people murmuring apologies to Marcus, while others avoided eye contact. Mrs. Wilson stood frozen, her face red with embarrassment. That night, Angela addressed the incident in a press conference, using it as a call to action against racial profiling in their city. Marcus, though shaken, held his head high, knowing his mom had his back, and that this was a moment for change.